The spit hit Michael right in the face. It was quick, unexpected, disgusting. The warm liquid trickled slowly down his cheek, and he felt its sticky viscosity clinging to his skin. But he didn't move. He stood there, still, letting the silence settle heavily around him. The entire precinct froze. No laughter, no murmurs. Just that moment of pure tension hanging in the air. It was more than an act of provocation. It was a warning. A clear way of saying he wasn't welcome there. Michael took a deep breath, keeping his expression unreadable. He wiped his face calmly, unhurried, as his eyes scanned the room. Some looks were defiant, others merely curious. But no one seemed surprised by what had just happened. Blue Ridge wouldn't be easy. He had already suspected that. But now he was sure. But to understand how he got to this moment, we need to go back a little. Michael Anderson was never the kind to be swayed by stories. Before accepting the position of chief of police in Blue Ridge, he had heard the rumors about the town, small, isolated, with a past full of secrets and a peculiar way of handling its own problems. But he had always believed that nothing replaces first-hand experience. He needed to see it with his own eyes. And what he found, at first glance, was a curious place. Narrow streets, old brick sidewalks, storefronts that seemed unchanged for decades. The town had a quiet charm, but there was something beneath that calm surface. Something only those who truly lived there could see. People watched him as if they already knew he didn't belong. Every step he took seemed to draw attention. He didn't need to be an expert to recognize the distrust in their eyes. When he finally stepped through the precinct doors, the atmosphere wasn't much different. The building was old, with yellowed walls and the strong scent of stale coffee. The air felt heavy, charged with something unseen. The officers greeted him out of politeness, but he noticed the resistance. Some shook his hand with a firm, measured grip, as if testing his strength. Others didn't even bother hiding their indifference. Michael hadn't expected a warm welcome, but he knew he had a long road ahead before he could establish himself there. He had been through similar situations before, and in every case the key was the same: observe, understand, adapt. For now, he just needed to take it all in, every detail, every silence, because one thing was certain: Blue Ridge was no ordinary town, and he needed to find out why. Michael knew that changing the Blue Ridge precinct would take more than direct orders. He had seen this kind of resistance before, systems corroded from the inside out, where rules were just a facade to hide the true power dynamics. If he tried to impose changes from the top down, he would only encounter barriers, silent boycotts, and worse, betrayal. He needed to see the town through the eyes of those who lived there, understand their fears, loyalties, and unspoken codes. That's when the idea came to him: infiltrate as an ordinary citizen. That night, standing before the mirror in his small rented apartment, Michael began his transformation. He left his uniform, neatly folded on the chair, and put on worn clothes, ragged jeans, an old flannel shirt, and a coat that had seen better days. He paused for a moment, running his hand over his chin, feeling the roughness of his stubble. He grabbed a cap, pulled it low, and stared at his reflection. This was a different version of himself, just another man. Without drawing attention, he began to roam the area around the precinct. He knew he couldn't just show up out of nowhere without raising suspicion, so he took a discreet approach. He visited local cafes, the bars where the officers unwound after their shifts, and even the precinct lobby, where he blended in with other citizens waiting for service. In the first few hours, he noticed the pattern of behavior among the officers. Some came in with rigid postures, shaking hands firmly with colleagues, and left quickly, as if they didn't want to be seen there for too long. Others, more relaxed, laughed loudly and spoke without a filter, confident they were among friends. But what really caught his attention were the silences, the exchanged glances, the small gestures of discomfort, the civilians who avoided eye contact with the law enforcement, dodging any conversation that lasted longer than necessary. On the third night, sitting in a rundown bar 2 blocks from the precinct, Michael overheard perhaps accidentally or perhaps on purpose, his first real clue. Two officers were drinking at the counter, speaking carelessly. "I don't know why we're wasting time with this," one said, twirling his glass between his fingers. "Everyone knows no one's going to open their mouth." "Exactly," the other chuckled, taking a sip. "And the ones who do, well, you know." Michael kept his expression neutral, but inside his suspicions were confirmed. There was a code of silence in this town, something beyond the simple distrust between the public and the police. But what exactly were they covering up? In the days that followed, he dug deeper. He sat on park benches, watching how the young people interacted with the police, or rather how they avoided any interaction. He stopped at the markets, overhearing casual conversations that, here and there, carried a tone of frustration and fear. And then on Friday morning he witnessed something that sent chills down his spine. A woman walked into the precinct. Her face was drawn, her eyes swollen from crying all night. She wore an oversized coat, her shoulders hunched as if trying to make herself invisible. She stopped in front of the reception desk, wringing her hands. I need to speak with an officer," she said, her voice trembling. The officer on duty didn't even bother to lift his gaze from the papers. "What's the problem?" "It's about my brother. He's missing." The officer sighed, adjusting his position in the chair. "How long has he been missing?" 2 days, she answered quickly. The officer clicked his tongue, picking up a form with the same lethargy as if he were taking a coffee order. "Have you checked the hospital, the bar?" "He wouldn't do that," she insisted, stepping forward. "He always comes home. This has never happened before." The officer looked at her with boredom. "If he's only been gone for 2 days, it's too early to file a report. Come back when it's been 72 hours. But, no buts. Those are the rules." The woman stood still for a few seconds, as if trying to decide whether or not to insist. Then, she simply lowered her head and left. Michael watched the whole scene, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. The strangest part? No other officer reacted to it. No one seemed surprised. For Michael, it was clear. Disappearances were common here, and no one seemed to care. He didn't yet know the full extent of the problem, but one thing was certain. Something was deeply wrong in Blue Ridge. And when the time was right, all the notes he had been taking would be the key to changing everything. The game was just beginning. Michael already had a good sense of what was going on in Blue Ridge. The police weren't just inefficient, they were part of the problem. But one thing was observing from a distance. Another was feeling it firsthand, and he knew that if he truly wanted to understand what he was up against, he would need to provoke a reaction. That's how he met Ethan Carter. The name had already been circulating in the town's whispers, always accompanied by tense expressions and averted gazes. A veteran of the force, known not for his competence but for the fear he inspired. Ethan walked through the precinct as if he owned the place. His presence was heavy, his gaze filled with superiority. He spoke loudly, laughed exaggeratedly, and never missed a chance to remind everyone who was in charge. Michael had heard the stories, but nothing prepared him for what would come next. That morning, he returned to the precinct as just another regular citizen. His disguise was perfect. Worn, clothes, stubbled face, cap pulled low, he sat in a corner of the reception area pretending to wait for service. The environment was exactly as it had been on other days. A phone ringing unanswered, an officer drinking cold coffee behind the counter, a woman filling out a complaint, form that Michael knew would never be taken seriously. Then the doors slammed open. Ethan Carter entered. The atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations were cut off mid-sentence. The few citizens waiting shrank into their seats. Some officers straightened their backs, as if trying not to draw attention. Others lowered their heads, busying themselves with anything to avoid eye contact. Michael watched. Ethan crossed the lobby with heavy steps, chin lifted, eyes sharp. His patrol uniform was half unbuttoned, as if he didn't care to keep up even the slightest appearance of formality. The holstered gun seemed more like a symbol of intimidation than a tool of the job. Then his eyes fell on Michael, The expression of contempt appeared immediately. He furrowed his brow and approached, sizing him up as if he were looking at a piece of trash on the ground. "And you? What the hell are you doing here, asshole?" Ethan's voice was dripping with disdain. It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. Michael held his gaze for a moment, weighing his options. He chose to speak little. "Waiting for service," he answered calmly. Ethan snorted. A short, cruel laugh. "Waiting for service?" He looked around as if sharing a joke with the other officers. "And since when do we waste time with people like you?" Michael didn't respond. He just remained seated, his expression neutral. Ethan didn't like that. With a sharp motion, he ripped Michael's cap off his head and threw it to the floor. "Are you deaf, asshole? I asked what the hell you're doing here." The room fell silent. No one intervened. Some seemed uncomfortable, but no one dared defy Ethan. Michael felt the anger rising inside him. His instincts screamed to react. But he couldn't. Not yet. Ethan leaned in a little closer, his voice now a whisper laden with threat. "People like you only show up here to cause trouble." Michael held his ground. But before he could respond, it happened. Without warning, Ethan spat in his face. The warm saliva trickled slowly down Michael's cheek, and everything around him seemed to stop. The silence was absolute. Michael stayed still. He could feel everyone's eyes on him. The humiliation was evident. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what came next. Calmly, without showing any anger, he wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt. Then he lowered his head, pretending submission. Ethan's satisfied laugh echoed through the room. "Just what I thought," the veteran murmured, walking away as though he'd just crushed an insect. Michael didn't look at him. He didn't react. He simply picked his cap up from the floor, put it back on, and remained seated. But inside, he had already made his decision. This wasn't just another corrupt cop. Ethan was a cancer, and Michael was going to root him out. The meeting room was packed. The stuffy space felt smaller than it actually was, filled with the constant hum of officers trying to guess the reason for this sudden summons. Never before had everyone been called at the same time, without exception. That alone was enough to charge the atmosphere with tension. Some were restless, murmuring among themselves. Others stood silently against the walls, observing the movement with calculating eyes. At the back of the room, Ethan Carter leaned casually, arms crossed over his chest, and a mocking smile on his lips. To him, this was just another meaningless formality. Then Michael walked in, and this time, without disguise. The sound of conversation died the moment he crossed the door. His perfectly pressed police chief uniform, adorned with the shiny insignia on his chest, stood in stark contrast to the image of the man who, days earlier, had been humiliated in the precinct's reception area. His posture was firm, his gaze unwavering. Eyes widened, faces tense, whispers cut off mid-sentence. The impact was evident. Michael walked slowly to the center of the room, each step echoing on the aged wooden floor. He didn't speak immediately. He just observed. Eyes darted away from his gaze, hands intertwined. The tension was almost tangible. Then he spoke. "I imagine many of you are wondering why you're here." His voice was firm but not raised, the tone of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "So let's get straight to the point. My name is Michael Anderson, and I'm the new police chief of Blue Ridge." The revelation hit like a bombshell. Some officers exchanged quick glances, trying to absorb the information. Others simply swallowed. Hard discomfort evident. But Michael kept his focus on one man, Ethan Carter. He didn't move, but Michael noticed. The brief moment when the color drained from his face. The muscle in his jaw tensed, the way his fingers clenched his arms. It was a fleeting moment. The next second, Ethan resumed his cynical smile. But Michael already knew. He continued. "In the past few days, I've been among you without you knowing who I was." His eyes scanned the group, pausing briefly on each of the faces before him. "I observed. I listened. I learned." He paused, allowing his words to sink deeply into their minds, and "I saw things that should not happen within a police department." The room remained in absolute silence. Michael took a step forward, crossing his arms. This ends now. The weight of those 3 words made even the most confident officers squirm uncomfortably. Then, he directed his gaze straight at Ethan Carter. Ethan Carter. The veteran raised his chin, the smile still present, but his eyes were dark. You are suspended immediately. This time the shock was universal. A collective murmur filled the air. Some officers seemed stunned. Others looked sideways at Ethan, waiting for his reaction. The veteran slowly uncrossed his arms, narrowing his eyes. Based on what? His voice was rough, filled with disbelief and contained fury. Michael didn't look away. Based on the unacceptable behavior you've shown in the past few days. Based on the reports I've heard and the actions I've witnessed firsthand. His voice remained calm, but there was steel in every word. And before you leave, I suggest you listen closely to what I have to say. Ethan opened his mouth to retort, but Michael raised a hand, cutting him off before he could speak. From now on, this precinct will no longer be a breeding ground for abuse of power, intimidation, and neglect. His voice echoed through the room. If you wear this uniform to feel above the law, you're in the wrong place. He scanned the room with his eyes, taking in every expression, every reaction. My goal here isn't to unjustly pursue anyone. I don't want enemies within this precinct. I want officers who understand what it means to honor this badge. If you're one of them, you will have my respect and my trust. But if you think you're untouchable, consider yourself warned. The silence was complete. Ethan clenched his fists but said nothing. He knew that, at this moment, any rash response could be his downfall. Michael took a step back and gestured to one of the officers near the door. The suspension is effective immediately. Carter, hand over your gun and badge. The tension in the air was almost palpable. The veteran hesitated for a long moment, his eyes burning with rage. Then, with no other choice, he reached for his holster, removed the gun, and placed it on the table. The badge followed soon after. He stared at Michael one last time before leaving the room, his heavy footsteps echoing on the floor. The door shut. Behind him, Michael turned to the rest of the room. Now, if anyone has any doubts about the seriousness of the change we're implementing, I suggest you speak now. No one said a word. Michael nodded. Then let's get to work. He turned and walked out of the room. He knew the battle was just beginning, but at that moment, he had landed the first big blow, and Blue Ridge would never be the same. The days following Ethan Carter's suspension were a true test by fire. Michael knew that removing one man wasn't enough to change an ingrained culture of abuse and corruption. The real challenge was earning the trust of the citizens and transforming the precinct into something that truly served the community. But trust isn't demanded, it's built. And that's exactly what he did. Ethan's suspension was just the beginning. While he was still out of the precinct, Michael used the time to dig deeper into his actions. Neglected reports, archived complaints, ignored testimonies. Ethan wasn't just an aggressive officer. He was a symbol of the impunity that had reigned for years in Blue Ridge. With patience and method, Michael gathered evidence. Some people began to speak out, still afraid but willing to help. One particular tip caught his attention: the disappearance of a young man months before, a case that had been shelved due to a lack of evidence. Michael reopened the investigation and followed every lead. And then he found the truth. The young man hadn't disappeared on his own. He was the victim of a dirty scheme involving police intimidation and violence, and Ethan was at the center of it all. With the evidence in hand, Michael did what the town never thought possible. He arrested Ethan Carter. The scene was symbolic. The man who had once considered himself untouchable, who humiliated anyone who dared to question him, was now being escorted out of the precinct in handcuffs. Under the watchful eyes of his former colleagues, some tried to defend him. Others stayed silent, waiting to see how far Michael would go. But the town noticed. The fear that had hung over Blue Ridge began to dissipate. For the first time in years, justice felt real. The cleanup in the precinct continued. Michael instituted new guidelines, training, and protocols to ensure the culture of impunity wouldn't return. Some officers resisted and requested transfers. Others, gradually, began to see that this change wasn't just necessary, It was inevitable, but nothing was more important than the community's reaction. Looking back, Michael knew that the public's trust in the police had been broken long ago. No one reported crimes because they knew nothing would be done. No one sought protection because they were more afraid of the law than the criminals. So he went to them. He talked to shopkeepers, visited families, made sure to become a familiar face around town. Slowly, people began to respond. Reports increased, but not out of fear. Now they believed something could be done. Blue Ridge was changing. One night, Michael sat on the porch of his house watching the distant lights of the town. That's when he heard footsteps approaching. "Thought you'd still be awake," a familiar voice said. It was Michael's grandfather, a man of few words but a commanding presence. He sat next to his grandson, gazing at the quiet town. "You did it," he said after a long silence. Michael let out a soft laugh. "Did I? There's still so much to be done." The old man nodded. "There always will be. But look around." He made a vague gesture toward the town. "People are walking differently, talking differently, they believe again. That hasn't happened in a long time." Michael sat quietly for a moment, absorbing his words. He knew there were no absolute happy endings. There would always be challenges, injustices, and battles to fight. But that night, under the calm stars of Blue Ridge, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, and that, more than anything, was the beginning of a new future.